August 1947. The United Kingdom is leaving the jewel of its empire behind. After nearly 2 centuries of British rule, independence has finally arrived for India, but freedom would not come quietly. In a matter of weeks, maps were redrawn, borders carved through villages, railways, homes, and families. One nation became 2, India and Pakistan. What followed was one of the largest migrations in human history. Millions crossed borders overnight, neighbours became enemies, entire communities vanished in flames and chaos. At the centre of it all were politicians, revolutionaries, colonial officials, and ordinary people trapped in a history moving far too fast. This is the story of the partition. The story of freedom, division, and the lines that changed South Asia forever. Let's begin. Before there was partition, before the borders, the trains, the violence, and the chaos, there was trade. In the year 1600, British East India Company received permission from the English Crown to trade with the East Indies. At first, its ambitions in India were commercial. Spices, cotton, silk, indigo, tea. Enormous wealth flowed through Indian ports, and the company wanted its share. For decades, the British were simply one group among many foreign traders operating in the region. The powerful Mughal Empire still dominated much of the subcontinent, and the East India Company relied on permission from local rulers to build trading posts in cities like Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. But as time passed, the balance of power began to shift. The Mughal Empire weakened during the 1700s, and regional kingdoms competed for influence. The East India Company saw opportunity. It built private armies made up largely of Indian soldiers known as sepoys. Company officials made alliances with princes, interfered in succession disputes, and increasingly acted less like merchants and more like rulers. Then came a turning point. In 1757, at the company, forces under Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal. It was a relatively small battle, but its consequences were enormous. Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world at the time, fell under British influence. From there, expansion accelerated. Over the next century, the company extended its control across vast areas of the subcontinent through warfare, diplomacy, annexation, and economic domination. Indian rulers who resisted were defeated. Those who cooperated often became dependent on British support. And while Britain grew richer from India's resources and trade, resentment also grew among many Indians. By the mid-1800s, tensions were everywhere. Indian soldiers in the company army were frustrated by poor treatment and discrimination. Princes had lost kingdoms. Farmers faced crushing taxes. Religious and cultural anxieties spread as British influence deepened. Then, in 1857, the situation exploded into open rebellion. Sepoys in the company army mutinated against their British officers, and the uprising rapidly spread across northern and central India. Some saw it as a military revolt. Others saw it as the first major war of Indian independence. Cities rose against British control. Civilians were caught in brutal fighting. Massacres were carried out by both rebels and British forces. The rebellion was eventually crushed after months of violence. But the shock it caused changed everything. The British East India Company was blamed for the disaster, and in 1858, the British government dissolved the company entirely. Control of India passed directly to the British Crown. And from that point onward, India would not be ruled by merchants, but by the empire itself. This new era became known as the British Raj. The British Raj presented itself as a force of order and progress. The British built railways stretching thousands of miles across the subcontinent. Telegraph lines connected distant cities. New universities, courts, and administrative systems appeared. Huge imperial buildings rose in places like Bombay, Calcutta, and Delhi. To British officials, this was proof that the empire worked. But beneath the image of stability was a very different reality. India's economy was increasingly shaped to benefit Britain. Raw materials flowed out of the country, while British manufactured goods flooded in. Many traditional Indian industries declined, and millions of farmers struggled under heavy taxation and debt. Famines devastated parts of India during the 19th century, killing millions. Critics argued that British policies often made these disasters worse. At the same time, a new educated Indian middle class was beginning to emerge. Lawyers, journalists, teachers, and students started asking difficult questions. Why should India be ruled by a foreign power? Why were Indians excluded from the highest positions in government? And why should Britain decide India's future at all? In 1885, a group of Indian intellectuals and political leaders formed the Indian National Congress. At first, Congress was moderate. Its members petitioned the British for greater representation and reforms rather than outright independence. But over time, frustration grew. Many Indians felt Britain was unwilling to share real power. Meanwhile, religious and political divisions were also becoming more significant. India was incredibly diverse, home to Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and many other communities speaking hundreds of languages across vast regions. Some Muslim leaders were worried that in a democratic future India, Muslims could become politically overshadowed by the Hindu majority. In 1906, the All India Muslim League was founded to represent Muslim political interests. At first, Congress and the Muslim League sometimes cooperated, but tensions between different political visions for India would continue to grow in the decades ahead. Then came the First World War. Over 1 million India soldiers and labourers supported the British war effort overseas. Indian leaders hoped that loyalty during the war would be rewarded with greater self-government afterwards. Instead, many felt betrayed. In 1919, anger against the British rule reached a breaking point. The British government introduced the Rowlatt Acts, laws that allowed people to be arrested without trial and gave the authorities sweeping powers to crush interests. Across India, protests erupted, and then on the 13th of April 1919, thousands of civilians gathered in the city of Amritsar during the festival of Baskali. So I'm very sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm so sorry if I've offended anyone. Yeah, please let me know in the comments how it's pronounced, please do. Some were protesting peacefully, others were simply there for the celebrations. Without warning, British troops under General Reginald Dyer blocked the exits to a walled garden called Jallianwala Bagh. Please, again, let me know in the comments. Then they opened fire. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed. Many more were wounded. This horrified India. For many, it destroyed any remaining faith that British rule could ever be fair or just. At the centre of the growing independence movement was a man who would become one of the most famous political figures in modern history, Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi believed India could defeat the British not through war, but through mass, non-violent resistance. He encouraged boycotts of British goods, peaceful protest marches, and acts of civil disobedience. Millions followed him. People spun their own cloth instead of buying British textiles. Protests had filled the streets. Workers went on strikes. Students left British-run schools. The British arrested Gandhi multiple times, but every arrest only seemed to strengthen the movement. At the same time, another important leader was rising within the Muslim League, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Jinnah had once supported cooperation between his Hindus and Muslims, but as political tensions deepened during the 20s and 30s, he increasingly argued that Muslims needed stronger protections and political autonomy. Meanwhile, younger leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru pushed Congress towards demanding complete independence rather than gradual reform. The relationships between Congress, the Muslim League, and the British government became more strained with every passing year. And then the world was pulled into another catastrophic war. When the war began in 1939, the British government declared that India was at war alongside Britain, without consulting Indian political leaders. The decision caused outrage. The Indian National Congress argued that Britain could not claim to be fighting for freedom in Europe while denying freedom to India. Congress leaders demanded a clear promise of independence after the war. The British refused. In protest, Congress ministries resigned across India. The All India Muslim League, however, took a different approach. Under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the League cooperated more closely with the British during the war years, strengthening its political influence. And in the 1940s, at a meeting in Lahore, the Muslim League formally called for separate Muslim majority states in the northwestern and eastern India. The idea would eventually become Pakistan was beginning to take shape. Meanwhile, Congress launched one of the largest anti-British movements yet. In 1942, Mahatma Gandhi called on the British to quit India. Many protests swept the country. Demonstrators attacked railway stations, government buildings, and communication lines. The British responded with mass arrests and crackdowns. Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and thousands of other leaders were imprisoned. Despite the repression, Britain's grip on India was weakening. The war had exhausted the British Empire economically and militarily. Millions of Indian soldiers had fought overseas, and many now expected political change in return. At the same time, communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims were worsening. Political negotiations became increasingly bitter. Congress insisted on a united independent India. The Muslim League argued that Muslims were a separate nation that needed its own state for security and political rights. Riots and violence between communities began erupting in several cities. Then, in 1945, the war ended. Britain was financially devastated. Maintaining control over India was becoming impossible. In the following year, British government sent ministers to India to negotiate a transfer of power, but attempts to create a united government collapsed amid mistrust and political deadlock. As negotiations failed, violence spread further. By 1946, the future of India hung in the balance. In August 1946, the political crisis turned deadly. The All India Muslim League declared a direct action day to demonstrate the support for the creation of Pakistan. In the city of Calcutta, huge crowds filled the streets. Then violence erupted. For days, Hindu and Muslim mobs attacked one another across the city. Homes and shops were burned, civilians were beaten and killed in the streets. Bodies lay abandoned on roadsides as order collapsed. And it did not stop there. Communal riots spread to other regions, including Noakhali, Bihar, and Punjab. Fear and mistrust between communities deepened rapidly. Families who had lived alongside one another for generations suddenly faced uncertainty about whether they could remain safely in their own towns. Meanwhile, Britain searched deeply for a solution. In early 1947, Prime Minister Clement Attlee announced that Britain would leave India no later than June 1948. A new viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was sent overseas to transfer the power. Mountbatten quickly concluded that keeping India united might no longer be possible. Negotiations intensified between Congress leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel, again in the comments tell me how to pronounce that, and Muslim League leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Eventually, Congress reluctantly accepted partition as the price of independence. The decision would divide British India largely along religious lines. Muslim-majority areas would form Pakistan. Hindu-majority areas would remain India. But there was one enormous problem. Nobody had actually decided where the borders would go. A British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never ever visited India before, was given just weeks to draw the boundaries between the two future nations. The task was almost impossible. Punjab and Bengal contained huge mixed populations of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs living side by side. Railways, rivers, farms, and entire communities would be cut apart by whatever line was drawn. And yet the deadline remained fixed. Britain would leave in August 1947, whether India was ready or not. And as the summer of 1947 arrived, the atmosphere across the subcontinent changed. It was no longer just political negotiation in conference rooms in Delhi or London. It was fear on the streets, rumours in villages, and uncertainty in every household. In Punjab and Bengal, communities that had lived side by side for generations began to look at one another differently. Not always with hatred, but with worry, with questions no one could answer. Where would the border fall? Which town would end up in India, and which in Pakistan? And more importantly, which side would you be on when it was finally drawn? The Boundary Commission under Cyril Radcliffe worked under immense pressure. Maps were redrawn again and again, districts were argued over late into the night. Every line meant millions of lives being placed into a new national identity. But there was no time for certainty. In Punjab especially, tension rose first. Sikh and Hindu populations feared being placed into Pakistan. Muslim communities feared reprisals in India. Militias began to form. Weapons that had once been hidden were now carried openly. Trains, once symbols of connection across the empire, began to be watched with suspicion, because now every journey could be the last. And then the decisions finally came. The borders were ready, but they would not bring peace. They would bring something far more chaotic than anyone had fully imagined. In the weeks that followed, the scale of the crisis became impossible to ignore. Across Punjab, Bengal, and beyond, the movement of people turned into something closer to panic. Entire families left their homes with only what they could carry: bundles of clothes, a few utensils, documents tied in cloth. Everything else was left behind. For many, there was no choice. Rumours of attacks spread faster than official news. A single story of violence in one village can trigger an exodus in another. Refugee columns formed on roads. Long, slow-moving streams of people heading towards what they believed would be safety. Some travelled by foot for days. Others packed into overcrowded trains that were quickly nicknamed ghost trains after they arrived, carrying the dead instead of the living. Law and order was breaking down in places where it had once been taken for granted. Local authorities struggled to respond. Police were overwhelmed. In some areas, they were absent entirely. Armed groups began to take control of the situation, and revenge attacks escalated the violence further. What made the situation even more devastating was its intimacy. This was not a distant war between armies. It was neighbours against neighbours. People who had shared markets, festivals, schools and streets were now divided by religion and fear. In many cases, violence followed routes of migration. Trains and convoys carrying refugees were ambushed. Entire journeys became unpredictable, shaped by rumour and survival instinct rather than any safe passage. And while millions moved across the new borders, others stayed behind, unsure whether to leave, unable to leave, or unwilling to abandon homes their families had lived in for generations. By late 1947, it was clear that partition was not just a political event. It was a human catastrophe unfolding in real time. As 1947 drew to a close, the violence reached its most concentrated and devastating levels in the region of Punjab. Here, the new border cut directly through communities, farmland, railway lines, and entire districts. There was no natural division, only a hurried line on a map that people were now being forced to live inside. The result was mass displacement on a scale few had ever seen. Hindu and Sikh populations moved east towards India. Muslim populations moved west towards Pakistan. But the journeys were rarely orderly. Roads were overcrowded, supplies were scarce, and safety could change from one village to the next. Convoys of refugees sometimes travelled with armed escorts, but even that was not enough to guarantee protection. Attacks could come suddenly, often driven by cycles of retaliation that had built up over weeks of fear and loss. In cities like Lahore and Amritsar, once vibrant and diverse centres of culture and trade, neighbourhoods emptied out. Homes were abandoned mid-meal, shops left with goods still on the shelves, schools closed without notice. The social fabric of entire regions was unravelling. At the same time, administrative systems struggled to establish control. The newly formed governments of India and Pakistan were still finding their footing. Resources were stretched, communication was limited, and the scale of the humanitarian crisis far exceeded expectations. Relief camps were set up wherever space could be found. Railway stations, open field, abandoned buildings. Millions of displaced people passed through them, often with little more than temporary shelter and basic food supplies. And even as the worst of the violence slowly began to subside in some areas, its consequences were becoming permanent. Families were separated across borders they could not cross. Communities that had existed for centuries were now split between two nations. And the map drawn in haste had become a lived reality. By the end of 1947, partition was no longer something unfolding. It had already happened. What remained was its aftermath. As 1948 began, the immediate waves of violence had started to slow in some regions, but the damage was already irreversible. The new border between India and Pakistan were now being enforced more formally, turning what had been confusion into permanent separation. Railway lines that had once carried people freely across the subcontinent were now controlled, restricted, and redirected. Crossing from one side to the other required paperwork, identity, and permission, all things that many refugees no longer had. In refugee camps across northern India and Pakistan, the scale of displacement became clearer. Millions of people were still without homes. Some had lost their entire families during the journey. Others had arrived safely but found nothing waiting for them on the other side. Cities like Delhi, Lahore, and Karachi were overwhelmed by arrivals. Temporary camps expanded into long-term settlements. Food shortages and disease became serious concerns, adding another layer of hardship to an already devastating situation. Governments on both sides now face the task of rebuilding, not just infrastructure, but entire societies. New administrations had to absorb refugees, restore order, and create functioning states almost from nothing. In India, leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel worked to unify a vast and diverse country still reeling from the partition. In Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah faced the enormous challenge of building a new nation from scratch, while dealing with overwhelming numbers of displaced people. And beneath the political rebuilding, something quieter but just as profound was happening. People were trying to redefine identity. What did it mean to be Indian or Pakistani now? What happened to families divided by a border they never chose? And could communities that had been torn apart ever truly be repaired? For many, partition was not just a single moment in 1947. It was a lifelong separation that continued to shape generations. And its consequences were only just the beginning to settle in history. As the new year progressed, the story of partition shifted from immediate chaos to long-term consequence. The borders between India and Pakistan were now firmly established, but they were far from stable in spirit. Disputes over territory, resources, and identity continued to create tension between the two new nations almost immediately after independence. One of the most serious early flashpoints was the region of Kashmir. Princely state with a mixed population and Hindu ruler, Kashmir's future had been left undecided during partition. When conflict broke out over its succession, both India and Pakistan claimed it, turning the issue into a long-term source of dispute and violence. But beyond the political borders, the human reality of partition remained unresolved. Millions of refugees were still rebuilding their lives from scratch. Many had lost homes, businesses, land, and family members. In cities across both countries, new neighbourhoods formed almost overnight, shaped by displacement rather than tradition. Entire districts became defined by the memory of where people had come from, rather than where they were now. At the same time, efforts to recover and document what happened began slowly. Survivors shared stories of journeys across borders, of trains that never arrived safely, and of villages emptied in days, and of friendships destroyed by fear. But for many, silence became the response instead. The scale of trauma was too large, too painful, or too dangerous to fully speak about in public. Partition was not only a political division, it was a personal one. It divided families, languages, friendships, and histories. And as the years passed, it became clear that its legacy would not fade. It would be carried forward, generation after generation, in memory and identity. What had begun as the end of an empire had become something far more enduring, a division that would shape South Asia long after the maps were drawn. As the years moved further from 1947, the immediate smoke of partition began to fade, but its outlines remained everywhere. In India and Pakistan, and an area which is now Bangladesh, which was then called East Pakistan, new generations were born into countries that had only recently been created. For them, partition was not something they had lived through, but something they had inherited. The stories, however, did not disappear. They were carried into families who crossed borders and never returned, in photographs kept in envelopes, in names of villages still spoken quietly at dinner tables, in memories of homes that no longer existed on the same side of the map. Governments on both sides focused on building the future, strengthening institutions, defining national identity, and establishing their place in the world. But the shadow of partition continued to influence politics, diplomacy, and daily life. The border itself became more than a line. It became a checkpoint, a barrier, and at times a wound that reopened with every new conflict or disagreement. And yet, despite everything that had been lost, life continued. Markets reopened, cities expanded, schools filled again with children who would never know the undivided subcontinent their grandparents remembered. But even as normality returned on the surface, the memory of partition remained just beneath it, shaping how people understood belonging, difference, and home. Because partition was never only an event in history. It became a part of our identity itself. And that's where we'll leave this episode. The partition is often remembered as a moment in history. A date on the timeline, a border drawn on a map. But for millions of people, it was something much larger than that. It was a movement, loss, arrival, separation, survival. And its story doesn't end neatly because in many ways it never really ended. Thank you for listening. Join us next time when we step back into history once again. Good night.